For 7 quiet years, the Pembrokes lived their lives on Elm Street without anything remarkable disturbing their routines, until the week their cat vanished without a trace. It happened on a cool October morning, the kind where the air tastes like changing seasons. Dorothy noticed it first, not because she adored the animal, but because she kept track of every detail in her home the way some people track storms. She marked the disappearance on the kitchen calendar, her pen gliding across the square for Tuesday the 15th, nodding the absence like another chore to be managed. Her daughter Constance took it differently. That night she pressed her palms and forehead to the cold window pane, scanning the dark yard as though the shadows might return her friend. "He'll be back," she whispered, her breath clouding the glass. Perhaps she believed it. Kids often do. But Dorothy had lived enough life to know that the things that vanish rarely return the same, if they return at all. She learned that truth young. Her mother had gone into the hospital when Dorothy was just 12, only to come home half a year later speaking softly, moving carefully as if any sudden sound might shatter her. Her first husband left for war and returned with medals, and nightmares so fierce he sometimes woke shouting names Dorothy had never heard. Things come back changed, she'd learned. Some never come back at all. A missing cat felt simple in comparison. Charles, her second husband, tried to fix things the way he fixed everything, with action. He printed flyers, tacked them to telephone poles, and walked block after block with a staple gun in hand. A blurry picture of Whiskers stared from every corner of the neighborhood, offering $20 to anyone who found him. Dorothy suspected it wasn't love for the cat driving Charles. It was the quiet heartbreak in Constance's eyes. But time has its own rhythm. October slid into November, the flyers curling at the edges. November shrank into December, and the faces on the street stopped reading the signs entirely. Even Constance eventually stopped asking, though sometimes Dorothy still found her daughter standing at the window, watching the darkness as if waiting for something she couldn't quite name. The new year arrived, snow melted, life moved forward. Charles gathered the worn flyers in January, smoothing out their creases before carrying them downstairs and placing them among the relics of good intentions that had never gone far. The unused exercise bike, the dusty woodworking tools, the half-finished bookshelf leaning slightly askew. And from that moment on, no one in the house mentioned the cat again. But quietly, so quietly no one dared acknowledge it, none of them went down to the basement anymore. Spring crept back into Elm Street with soft breezes and pale sunlight, pretending everything was new again. But inside the Pembroke house, nothing felt renewed. Dorothy noticed it in small, quiet ways. Constance, now 14, moved through the days like she was drifting underwater. She spoke less. She smiled less. She kept her bedroom door closed for long stretches, then appeared at mealtimes picking half-heartedly at her food, always tilting her head as if waiting for a sound only she could hear. "Teenagers get like this," Charles said when Dorothy mentioned the shift, brushing it aside with the confidence of someone who trusted easy explanations. "It's normal." Dorothy had lived long enough to know that the word normal could hide entire storms. Her own mother's unraveling had been dismissed as nothing more than household stress, until the day she'd stood at the bathroom sink, pouring bleach into her hair while muttering about voices whispering through the walls, insisting they were trying to purify her thoughts. So when the scratching began, soft, rhythmic, unmistakably deliberate, Dorothy froze. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind that smelled faintly of rain, almost exactly 1 year after their cat had vanished. Dorothy stood at the sink, her hands buried in warm, sudsy water, scrubbing a glass in slow circles. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound tugged at something in her memory, a distant echo she couldn't immediately summon. Then she heard Constance from the living room, her voice sharp, bright, bursting with a happiness Dorothy hadn't heard in months. "Why's, oh my God, Mom, it's Whiskers." Dorothy set the glass aside, wiping her damp hands on her apron. She didn't hurry. Things that return after long absences often come back wearing familiar shapes, but rarely with familiar truths. She had learned to greet returns with caution, not relief. Still, she opened the kitchen door. And there he was. Whiskers sat on the back step as if he had been gone for only a few minutes, not a full year. His orange fur looked thicker, almost richer in color, but not dirty. His body showed no signs of hunger or struggle. His green eyes blinked up at her with that cool, unreadable patience she'd always found unsettling. No limping, no fear, no scar. Nothing to explain 12 months of silence. "Where were you?" Constance practically cried as she rushed past, scooping the cat into her arms with trembling hands, holding him as if she were afraid he might dissolve into mist. "Where have you been this whole time?" The cat answered with a low, steady purr, soft, distant, like the rumble of a storm still sitting just beyond the horizon. And for the first time in months, the house felt full again, but not in a way that made Dorothy feel comforted. The draft drifting through the open front door wasn't the reason Dorothy suddenly felt cold. It was an instinctual chill, the kind that hits you when the atmosphere in a room shifts for no logical reason. Charles stepped out of his office, drawn by the commotion, wearing the smug grin of a man who loves being right. "See, I told you," he said, looking at the scene with pure self-satisfaction. "Nature always brings them home." But Dorothy didn't remember him predicting anything of the sort. The cat melted into Constance's arms with an unnerving fluidity. While the child cried tears of relief, Dorothy watched the animal's eyes. It was settling in too perfectly, too comfortably. She found herself asking a silent, terrifying question. Was the creature that walked back into their house truly the same one that had vanished? By nightfall, the cat had reclaimed its throne at the foot of Constance's bed, as if no time had passed at all. Later, lying in the dark, Dorothy listened to the rhythm of the house. Beside her, Charles slept the deep, heavy sleep of the oblivious. She tried to pinpoint what felt wrong. The furnace clicked, the fridge hummed, the floorboards settled. The sounds were routine, but the feeling was alien. The silence wasn't empty. It felt heavy, expectant, like an invisible audience holding its breath in the dark. She told herself she was just being paranoid, a habit born from years of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Yet she lay frozen until the sun came up, straining to hear something she prayed wasn't there. The peace lasted exactly 72 hours. The first casualty was the canary. Dorothy found it when she went down to start the coffee. The vibrant yellow bird lay motionless on the floor of its cage, one wing bent backward in a sickening, unnatural twist. The little metal door was wide open. Dorothy knew she had locked it the night before. She was obsessive about those locks. "Poor thing," Charles muttered, glancing at the cage while pouring his juice. "Probably panicked in the night, got out and flew into a wall." It was a logical, safe answer. A week ago, Dorothy would have believed it, but as she picked up the tiny, weightless body, logic failed her. She brushed back the feathers near the broken wing, and her blood ran cold. It wasn't a bruise from an impact. Hidden against the bird's ribs was a single, deep hole. It was a puncture wound, executed with terrifying, surgical precision. It was a hit, A precise, brutal puncture wound that had driven straight through to the heart. It was unmistakably a claw mark. Dorothy swallowed her panic, deciding instantly to keep this to herself. Charles dealt in logic and evidence. He wouldn't understand a fear that felt this primal. Instead, she wrapped the broken yellow bundle in a paper towel and took it outside. The morning air was crisp as she dug a shallow grave near the garden edge, marking it with a heavy stone. But as she patted the dirt down, the hair on her arm stood up. She spun around, looking back at the house. There, framed in the kitchen window, sat Whiskers. He wasn't just looking at her, he was studying her. His green eyes held a chilling mix of curiosity and cold calculation. The piece lasted another 48 hours before the aquarium went quiet. Dorothy found the carnage before her first cup of coffee. The 3 goldfish, which had been darting through the water the night before, were now bobbing listlessly on the surface, drifting among the plastic plants. The water was crystal clear, the filter humming its steady rhythm, but the violence was undeniable. Each fish bore the exact same signature, a single, clean hole pierced right behind the gill. Bizarre, Charles muttered, squinting at the glass as if the tank had personally insulted him. Must be a pH imbalance, or maybe a temperature spike. Dorothy nodded, making the right noises of agreement, but her eyes were locked on the floor. Whiskers was sitting just a few feet away. He was grooming himself with slow, deliberate strokes. As he extended a paw, Dorothy saw them. His claws looked longer than she remembered. They were hooked, gleaming, and sharp enough to perform surgery. By that afternoon, she couldn't take it anymore. With Charles at the office and Constance at school, she crated the cat and drove straight to Dr. Morrison. The vet was a no-nonsense woman who had been treating the neighborhood's pets for 30 years. She lifted Whiskers onto the steel table, running her hands over his spine, checking his ears, prying open his jaw. Honestly, Dorothy, he's immaculate, she said, stepping back. Whatever diet he found out in the wild, it worked wonders. What do you think he was eating? Dorothy asked, her voice tight. Dr. Morrison shrugged, peeling off her gloves. Who knows? Cats are survivors. Rodents, birds, bugs, they take what they can get. She paused, looking at the animal with professional admiration. I will say this, though, his muscle density is off the charts for a house cat. He's not just healthy, he's built like a predator who's been getting a lot of practice. Dorothy stared at Whiskers. He sat perfectly still on the metal table, eyes half closed, radiating a terrifying calmness. Is there any way to know where he went? Not a chance. They don't exactly keep travel logs. Dr. Morrison chuckled at her own joke, but the laugh died in her throat when she turned and saw the look of absolute dread on Dorothy's face. Is there something specific bothering you? Dorothy hesitated. The truth stuck in her throat. How do you explain to a medical professional that the animal sitting on the steel table feels like an imposter? That it feels less like a pet and more like something wearing a cat's skin like a cheap, baggy suit? She couldn't articulate the way he moved through the house now. He didn't trot with the clumsy comfort of a returning family member. He stalked the hallways with the cold, deliberate focus of a general surveying territory he planned to conquer. He feels different, she finally managed to whisper. Dr. Morrison gave a sympathetic nod, the kind reserved for neurotic owners. That's completely normal. Extended time in the wild changes them. They become independent. Often they become more aggressive. It's just survival. Aggressive. Dorothy latched onto the word, though she knew the vet meant scratched furniture. while Dorothy was imagining something far more sinister. That evening, the kitchen felt like a battleground. As she chopped vegetables, Dorothy watched Whiskers with the same hypervigilance she used to have while monitoring her dying mother's breathing. The cat didn't just walk, he flowed. But there was a new, predatory tension in his frame, a coiled energy that suggested he was constantly calculating the distance between himself and a kill. When Constance reached down to pet him, Dorothy's heart slammed against her ribs. She saw the shift. Whiskers' pupils blew wide, swallowing the green iris in a wash of black. His muscles bunched, tight and ready to snap. It was an ambush in the making. But at the last second, the tension dissolved. He leaned into the child's hand, purring. "I missed you so much," Constance cooed, burying her face in his fur. The purr rumbled through the room, but to Dorothy, it sounded wrong. It wasn't a vibration of contentment. It was a low, rhythmic frequency that triggered a memory of her grandmother's old folktales. Stories about spirits that took the shape of beloved pets to steal the breath from children while they slept. The escalation happened on Saturday morning. The victim was Buster, the hamster. Dorothy found the small brown and white body stiff in the cedar shavings. The cause of death was identical, a single surgical puncture to the throat. The cage door was locked. She didn't need to check. She knew she had secured the latch the night before with obsessive, mechanical precision. This time, she didn't call for Charles. She didn't cry out. She simply sat on the floor next to the cage, staring at the crime scene with the cold, hollow realization of a detective who finally understands they are locked inside with a serial killer. The water bottle was still full. The food bowl hadn't been touched. Buster hadn't died fighting. He had been extinguished. It was a clean, silent execution. When Charles found her an hour later, staring into the cage, he immediately retreated into the comfort of practical solutions. "We need an exterminator," he announced, hands on his hips. "Must be a weasel getting in through the foundation, or a rat." Dorothy nodded, barely hearing him. Her focus was locked on the hallway where Whiskers had materialized. He didn't make a sound, he just appeared as if the shadows had knit themselves together to form him. His green gaze met hers, and the intelligence behind it stopped her heart. It wasn't the look of a pet, it was the look of a conspirator. In that silent exchange, the message was clear. "I know you know, and I know you can't save them." She felt the crushing isolation of the truth. She knew, with the same bone-deep instinct that had warned her of her mother's cancer, that the cat was the killer. But she also knew that saying it aloud would only paint her as hysterical. Charles needed his logic. He needed to believe in rats and weasels because the alternative was unthinkable. That night the darkness felt heavy, pressing against her chest like a physical weight. Dorothy lay rigid, dissecting the silence. Her mind kept circling the void of the past year. Where had this creature gone? What dark academy of survival had he attended? What had he tasted out there in the cold that made him crave the hunt so deeply? Sometime past 2 in the morning, the rhythm of the house broke. The click of a latch, the soft, distinct patter of bare feet on the carpet. Dorothy stopped breathing. She listened as the footsteps moved down the hall, guided by a sound that made her blood freeze, a low, resonant thrumming. The purr wasn't comforting, it was hypnotic, a siren song pulling her daughter into the dark. Dawn brought a surreal, terrifying brightness. Dorothy found Constance at the stove, humming a cheerful tune as she pushed eggs around a skillet. Whiskers sat on the countertop, tail wrapped neatly around his paws, watching the girl with the intense, possessive focus of a handler. "Did you sleep well, sweetie?" Dorothy asked, her voice brittle. Constance turned, and the smile she wore was blinding. It wasn't just happy, it was euphoric. She looked lit from within. "I had the most beautiful dreams, Mom," she whispered, her eyes wide and glassy. Dorothy raised her coffee cup to her lips, fighting the tremors in her hands. She knew that look. She remembered it vividly from the hospice ward. It wasn't the glow of health. It was the terminal rally, the final, frantic burst of energy that flares up just before the light goes out forever. It was the look of a true believer. Dorothy had seen that same terrifying clarity in her mother's eyes decades ago, back when the dementia started whispering conspiracies from the wallpaper. It was the expression of someone who has been let in on a cosmic joke that the rest of us are too stupid to understand. As the days bled into weeks, the transformation wasn't subtle, it was biological. Constance stopped moving like a clumsy adolescent. She began to flow through the house with a liquid, unnerving grace. Her posture shifted, her neck holding her head at a sharp, inquisitive angle that mirrored the cat perfectly. Then came the hunger. The vegetables were pushed aside. Constance only had eyes for the meat, and she wanted it bloody. But the silence was worse than the dinner table tension. Passing Constance's door, Dorothy would freeze, pressing her ear against the wood. She could hear the girl whispering, low and fervent. And then a response. Not a human voice, but a vibration. A deep, guttural thrumming that twisted itself into the shape of syllables. The cat wasn't just purring, it was conversing. "She's just maturing, Dorothy," Charles said, waving a dismissive hand. "Teenage hormones, it's a phase." Dorothy stopped arguing. She started documenting. She filled a notebook with the impossible physics of their home. How Whiskers seemed to teleport from room to room. How he would stare at the front door seconds before the bell rang. How his eyes didn't just catch the light. They seemed to burn with their own cold, nuclear power in the dead of night. And terrifyingly, Constance was catching the infection. Dorothy would wake up to find her daughter standing like a statue in the center of a pitch-black living room, head cocked, listening to the empty air. When the flashlight beam hit her, Constance's eyes flared with that same reflective green luminescence. She didn't stomp down the hall anymore. She stalked. She was hunting the shadows. The breaking point came in the most mundane place imaginable, the local pet shop. She took the loss of the other animals so hard, Charles reasoned, staring at a wall of hamsters and parakeets. She needs something new to love. It'll help her settle down. Dorothy stood paralyzed under the fluorescent lights. She wanted to grab him, to shake him, to scream that they weren't buying pets. They were grocery shopping. They were hand-picking the next sacrifice for the thing that had taken over their home. But she swallowed the warning. She knew the rules of this game. Scream about monsters and get labeled crazy, or stay quiet and navigate the nightmare. She had learned from her mother that the label unstable was a cage you never really escaped. So she watched in silence as Charles paid for the slaughter. They brought home 2 guinea pigs. They were soft, nervous little things with wet eyes that seemed to understand they were being carried into a trap. Dorothy hid the cage in the living room, trying to create a buffer zone. But deep down, she knew walls meant nothing to the thing living under her roof. The execution happened that very night. Dorothy found them at sunrise. Both bodies lay stiff, victims of that same, terrifyingly precise puncture wound. But this time, the killer had been arrogant. A trail of crimson droplets led away from the cage, weaving across the floorboards and vanishing into the kitchen. As Dorothy knelt there, staring at the blood with the numb detachment of a crime scene photographer, she felt the temperature drop. She looked up, Constance was standing in the doorway. She was still in her nightgown, hair cascading over her shoulders, watching the scene with zero emotion. No tears, no horror. "They were on a clock anyway, Mom," Constance said. Her voice was flat, stripped of all childish empathy. "Everything ends. Whiskers just made it efficient." Dorothy searched her daughter's face, desperate to find the little girl who used to cry over dead butterflies. She found nothing. Constance looked serene, like a priestess who had made peace with a cruel god. "Where is he?" Dorothy whispered. Constance smiled. For a second the light caught her teeth and Dorothy recoiled. They looked jagged, too sharp, too long to be human. "He's resting," the girl hummed. "Real work takes a lot out of you." That afternoon, with the house empty, Dorothy went to war. She moved through the rooms methodically, hunting for proof. She started in the basement, shoving aside old boxes, tearing into the shadows she usually avoided. Behind the humming bulk of the water heater, she found the shrine. It wasn't a mess, it was a collection. Bones, dozens of them, had been scoured clean of flesh and bleached white. They weren't scattered, they were organized. Tiny ribs stacked like lumber, skulls arranged by size. It was a museum of small deaths. There were bird bones, fish spines, and bones from things Dorothy couldn't even identify. It wasn't just that the bones were there, it was the organization. They were sorted by type, stacked with the terrifying logic of a collector. But it was the item at the very back of the shelf that knocked the air out of Dorothy's lungs. She fell to her knees in the dust. It was a skull, smooth, white, and unmistakably human. It was tiny, no bigger than her fist, a baby or perhaps a toddler. She sat there in the dark for a long time, staring at the grim trophy. The realization washed over her with a cold, numbing clarity. This wasn't just about dead hamsters. She had crossed a line into a nightmare where the predator didn't just kill for food, it killed for sport, and its appetite had no ceiling. That evening, dinner felt less like a meal and more like a sacrificial offering. Dorothy seasoned the roast heavily, using herbs she hadn't touched in years, creating a rich, overpowering flavor. Charles ate with gusto, praising the change in recipe. Constance didn't say a word. She simply tore into the meat with a feral intensity, leaving her vegetables untouched, her focus absolute. When the dishes were cleared, Dorothy retreated upstairs. She didn't get ready for bed. Instead, she sat at her vanity and wrote the letter she had been composing in her head for days. It was addressed to her sister in Oregon, a woman who understood that the world was often darker than it looked. "If I am found dead," she wrote, the pen shaking slightly, "do not let them call it an accident, and do not let them call it suicide. The thing living in this house wears a familiar face, but it is not a pet. I've hidden my journal here. Read it, and please, watch Constance. I fear she is already gone." She folded the paper and buried it inside her jewelry box, hidden beneath the strand of pearls from her first husband. It was her final testimony. Then she lay down on top of the covers. She didn't change out of her clothes. She simply closed her eyes and waited. The wait ended shortly after midnight. The bedroom door drifted open with the softest whisper of a hinge. Dorothy forced her body to go limp, regulating her breathing to mimic the heavy rhythm of deep sleep. She was playing dead for an audience she couldn't see. The footsteps that crossed the carpet were soundless, a void where noise should be, but she knew it was there. The air in the room shifted, growing heavy and thick. And then came the smell, not the clean scent of a well-groomed house cat, but something ancient and foul. It was the musk of a deep, wet forest, the stench of damp earth and fresh blood. It smelled like copper and wet leaves. the scent of a raw, untamed forest seeping into a sterile bedroom. Dorothy felt the mattress dip. It wasn't the heavy compression of a person sitting down. It was the subtle, distributed weight of a predator stalking across unstable ground. She forced her lungs to expand and contract in the slow rhythm of sleep, even as she felt the heat of exhaled breath ghosting against her jugular. She sensed the muscles bunching, the silent calibration of the strike. When it happened, it was faster than thought, a blur of motion, a sharp pressure. But Dorothy didn't freeze. In that split second before the world went black, she turned her head. She had to know. The face staring back at her was Constance, but it was a Constance that had been carved away and reshaped. Her daughter's soft features had been pulled tight, sharpened into a terrifying, angular beauty. The eyes weren't human anymore. They were wide, glowing orbs of radioactive green. And when the mouth opened, it revealed the truth. Canines that had lengthened into jagged, needle-thin daggers, perfectly designed for the surgical precision Dorothy had been tracking for weeks. As the darkness swallowed her, Dorothy's final thought wasn't fear. It was a strange, heavy relief. The vigil was over. The waiting was done. But beneath the relief was a crushing sorrow. She had failed. She hadn't stopped the infection. She had only watched it take hold. But then again, as her heart stuttered to a halt, she wondered if anyone could have stopped it. Maybe some hungers are just too old, too deep to be kept out by a locked front door. Charles found her the next morning. The paramedics called it a massive cardiac event. It made sense. Dorothy was older, anxious, under stress. The tiny red puncture on her neck, dismissed as a trivial scratch, probably from a necklace clasp snagging as she collapsed. Logic, as always, smoothed over the jagged edges of the truth. And Constance was perfect. She wore the mourning black like a second skin. She cried at the right moments, accepted condolences with grace, and spoke about her stepmother with a touching, broken reverence. The neighbors whispered about her resilience, about how quickly she had matured in the face of tragedy. Charles, shattered by grief, poured every ounce of his remaining energy into his daughter. He was so focused on protecting her that he missed the details. He didn't see the unnatural, liquid way she moved through the hallways. He didn't notice that she had stopped sleeping, or that she now spent her nights sitting motionless in the center of pitch-black rooms, listening to the silence, waiting for the next hunt to begin. Grief is a powerful blinder. It narrowed Charles's world down to the size of his own heartache, leaving him completely oblivious to the predator grooming his daughter in the next room. He didn't wonder why the cages in the living room remained empty. He didn't question why Constance had stopped seeing her friends, or why she preferred the silent, intense company of the animal that shadowed her every step. To Charles, it looked like healing. To anyone paying attention, it looked like an apprenticeship. If he had looked outside, he might have noticed the missing posters stapled to the telephone poles, pictures of local cats and small dogs that had vanished without a trace. He might have found the grisly monuments hidden in the tall grass of the backyard. Small, white bones, stripped of flesh and stacked in geometric patterns that looked less like animal waste and more like religious offerings. But Charles wasn't looking, and by the time the unease finally pricked at the back of his neck, the metamorphosis was already finished. The neighbors heard it, though. On nights when the air was still, they whispered about the sounds drifting from the Pembroke residence. It wasn't quite talking, and it wasn't quite animal noise. It was a low, resonant vibration, a frequency that sounded like instructions being passed from master to student. But people are experts at denial. They dismissed it as the wind or the plumbing, because admitting the truth would mean acknowledging that their safe suburban street had been breached. To the casual observer, They were the perfect portrait of resilience. A grieving father and a devoted daughter, moving on with the help of a loyal pet who had miraculously found its way home. It was the ultimate camouflage. If Dorothy had been there, she would have recognized the trap immediately. She knew that the most dangerous monsters don't kick down doors. They wear the faces of the ones we love. They hide behind the facade of domesticity, waiting for the moment when the mask is no longer required. The thing that walked back into their lives that October night hadn't just returned. It had invaded. It understood that the most efficient way to consume a household wasn't to attack it, but to become it. Dorothy's final realization had been the only one that mattered. Nothing ever comes back from the unknown exactly the same as it left. Sometimes, what returns is simply a void wearing a familiar skin, an echo that knows exactly how to make a house feel like a home right before it devours everyone inside. That scratching at the door hadn't been a plea for shelter. It was an invitation. And the terrifying truth is, once you invite that kind of darkness in, it never really leaves. Story 2, The Doll in the Garden. The yellow telegram arrived on a Tuesday, or maybe it was a Wednesday. Grief has a way of scrambling the calendar, turning time into a gray, shapeless fog where the details just slip through your fingers like sand. Hugh Hartwell stood in the frame of the cottage door, the thin paper vibrating in his shaking hand. He read the message out loud, his voice cracking on the third attempt. Violet is safe. Returning Thursday. All is well. Love, Mother. Those words should have been the end of the nightmare. They should have been the moment his knees hit the floor in gratitude. But instead, a cold, heavy stone settled in the pit of his stomach. The message was too short, too clean. Their daughter had been gone for 6 days. 6 days since she had simply evaporated from the edge of her grandmother's garden in Little Wickham, disappearing in the blink of an eye between afternoon tea and sunset. 6 days of police dogs howling in the woods, of neighbors combing through the brush, of their family tragedy plastered across the local headlines for everyone to gawk at. 6 days of Hugh packing the floorboards until he wore a path in the rug, trying to bargain with God. And now suddenly, she was found. No explanation, no details on where she'd been or who took her or how she survived. Just a sterile clip note saying she was coming back. Hugh folded the paper with deliberate care, placing it on the hall table next to the stack of unread condolence cards from friends who didn't know what to say. She's coming home, he told the quiet room. Beatrice was sitting in the parlor, frozen like a statue. She was clutching her embroidery hoop with a white-knuckled grip, though the needle hadn't pierced the fabric since the moment Violet vanished. She looked up at him, and Hugh flinched. Her eyes were sunken, rimmed with dark, bruised circles that made her look like she was haunting her own house. When, she whispered. Her voice sounded rusty, unused. Thursday, Hugh said. Tomorrow. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just gave a single mechanical nod, a sharp, jerky motion, and turned her head back to the window. She stared out at their small, manicured garden, at the rows of lavender and rosemary that used to smell so sweet when Violet ran her hands through them. Now the garden just looked empty, waiting for something to fill the space. That night, the cold space beside him woke Hugh from a restless sleep. He found Beatrice in the nursery. She was perched on a small wooden chair next to the empty bed, her white nightgown glowing faintly in the moonlight like a shroud. She wasn't moving. Her hands were clasped tight in her lap, and she was staring intensely at the sheets she had already pulled back, waiting for a sleeper who wasn't there. Beatrice, he whispered. She didn't blink. He walked over to her slowly, careful not to startle her, like one approaches a wild animal or a sleepwalker. When he rested a hand on her shoulder, the fabric of her gown felt ice cold against his palm. "She'll be here tomorrow," he said gently. "I know," she murmured, her voice sounding far away, detached from the room. "I can feel her coming closer, can't you?" Hugh strained his ears against the silence. He heard the house settling, the wind scratching at the roof, but nothing else, just the hollow echo of his own anxiety. "Come back to bed," he urged. She let him guide her out of the room, but her body was stiff, and she kept glancing back at the empty bed, as if she were abandoning a post she had sworn to protect. The next morning, the sky opened up. A relentless, pounding rain turned their neat, manicured garden into a chaotic swamp of mud and gray water. Hugh stood at the kitchen window, watching the earth turn to sludge. His eyes drifted to the back door, where a pair of tiny red rubber boots sat gathering dust, silent, tragic monuments to a week of suspended time. The car appeared just after 2 o'clock. The engine whined and sputtered as the black sedan fought its way up the slick, steep driveway. By the time it rattled to a halt at the gate, the rain had softened into a thick, suffocating mist that blurred the edges of the world. Hugh and Beatrice stood on the porch, paralyzed. The driver's door opened and Beatrice's mother stepped out. She looked wrecked. Her hat was crooked, her hair escaping in wild wisps, and her usual ironclad posture was gone, replaced by a jittery, nervous energy. She looked scared. She reached for the rear door handle. Beatrice grabbed Hugh's arm, her fingernails digging into his bicep hard enough to draw blood. The door swung open. Violet stepped out into the gray afternoon. Hugh's first instinct wasn't joy, it was confusion. She looked, diminished. She seemed smaller than he remembered, as if the missing week had physically eroded her. It wasn't just that she looked smaller. It was as if the 6 days of silence had carved something out of her. She was wearing a dress Hugh had never seen before, stark, blinding white, with a ribbon that perfectly mimicked the icy blue of her eyes. There wasn't a scratch on her, no dirt under her fingernails, no tangles in her hair. She was terrifyingly pristine, as if she had been preserved in a glass case rather than lost in the wild. And she didn't run. A lost child coming home should have sprinted into her mother's arms. Violet just stood by the car, anchored to the spot by something she was clutching against her chest. When she finally started walking up the path, her gait was stiff and rhythmic, like a mechanism that had been wound too tight. That's when Hugh saw it. She was carrying a doll, but this wasn't a child's toy. It was massive, nearly 2 feet of pale, gleaming porcelain that seemed to catch the gray light. The craftsmanship was unnerving. It wore a gown of ivory silk fastened with tiny pearl buttons, intricate lace choking the collar, and miniature leather shoes polished to a lethal shine. The face was a masterpiece of impossible detail. Flushed cheeks, rosebud lips, and a cascade of dark ringlets that looked and moved like real human hair. But it was the eyes that made Hugh's blood run cold. They were glass, undeniably, yet they held a wet, depthless clarity that no object should possess. As Violet moved closer, Hugh had the sickening realization that the doll wasn't just staring forward, it was tracking him. The glass gaze seemed to lock onto his face with a sharp, predatory intelligence. "Violet," Beatrice choked out, her voice trembling. The girl looked up. Her expression wasn't relief or joy or fear. It was a blank, polite mask that felt both intimate and completely alien. "Hello, Mama," she said. Her voice was flat, stripped of all its childish musicality. She hoisted the porcelain figure higher, presenting it like royalty. "I've brought someone to meet you." She paused, stroking the doll's silk dress. "This is Cordelia. She's been waiting for me." The name hit Hugh like a physical blow to the chest. Cordelia. He couldn't place it, but the syllables echoed in his skull, vibrating with a dark, forgotten significance he couldn't quite reach. Beatrice didn't care about the doll. She just wanted her child. She surged forward, arms wide, desperate to pull her daughter close. But Violet didn't step into the embrace. She recoiled. She took a sharp, defensive step backward, shielding the doll with her own small body, prioritizing the porcelain over the flesh and blood reaching out for her. "Where did you go, baby?" Beatrice's voice cracked, vibrating with the terrified restraint of a mother afraid to break the spell. "We've been searching everywhere." "I was with Cordelia," Violet answered. Her tone was casual, as if she were describing a playdate down the street, not a week-long disappearance. "I was at her house. It's beautiful, Mama. The rooms never end and the garden goes on forever. She was just so lonely." Hugh shot a desperate look at his mother-in-law, who was still hovering by the car like a frightened bird. The older woman's face was ash-gray. She caught Hugh's eye and gave a sharp, almost invisible shake of her head, a silent command that screamed, "Do not ask. Do not push." "Violet," Hugh said, forcing a warmth into his voice that he didn't feel. "Let's get you inside. You must be starving. Mrs. Morrison made those jam tarts you like." For a split second, the mask slipped. A spark of genuine, childish hunger lit up Violet's eyes. "The strawberry ones." "The very same," Hugh managed a tight smile, though his stomach was doing flip-flops. Violet nodded and stepped past them, clutching the porcelain figure like a lifeline. But as she brushed by, Hugh caught a scent that made him recoil. It wasn't the smell of a child. No dirt, no fresh air, no soap. It was a thick, suffocating sweetness. It smelled like a funeral parlor, like lilies that had been sitting in stagnant water just long enough to start rotting. Inside, the cottage felt different. It was as if the walls had shrunk, or perhaps Violet had brought something with her that took up too much psychic space. She walked through the hallway with a bizarre hesitation, touching the banister and the side table as if she were a tourist visiting a museum of her own life. She marched into the parlor and climbed into the big wingback chair by the window. She didn't relax, though. She sat rigid, arranging the doll on her lap with obsessive care, turning its glass face outward to survey the room. "She likes to see everything," Violet murmured, adjusting the lace on the doll's dress. "She hates missing out. She's been alone in the dark for years." Beatrice knelt on the rug, her hands hovering near her daughter, afraid to touch her. "Sweetheart, where did you find her?" "I didn't find her," Violet corrected softly, her finger tracing the doll's glossy black ringlets. "She found me. She was waiting behind the big oak tree. She told me she'd been waiting for a special girl for a very long time." "What do you mean, special?" Beatrice whispered. Violet looked up. Her eyes were that same piercing blue, but the light behind them had shifted. It was older now. "Someone like me, Mama. Someone who can hear her voice. Someone who listens when she speaks." The hair on Hugh's arm stood straight up. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. "Dolls don't talk, Violet." Hugh tried to keep his voice steady, but the words felt hollow, like he was trying to explain physics to a ghost. Violet offered a smile that was terrifyingly patient, bordering on pity. "This one does, Papa. She has so much to say. She tells me stories about all the other children who came to play in her garden. She tells me about the games they played and why they never wanted to go home." The tea on the tray went cold. The jam tarts sat untouched, their sweetness suddenly nauseating. Hugh and Beatrice stared at their daughter, paralyzed by the soft, absolute conviction in her voice. This wasn't the rambling imagination of a 7-year-old. It was the report of a witness. Violet sat with a poise that belonged to a much older woman, someone who had seen things that aged the soul while leaving the body untouched. As the afternoon light faded into dusk, they tried to force life back into its normal shape. Violet agreed to her bath, but with one non-negotiable condition. The doll had to watch. She propped the porcelain figure on a stool right next to the tub, facing the water. "The steam will ruin her paint, darling," Beatrice tried, reaching for the toy. Violet stopped her with a look of quiet authority. "Cordelia isn't afraid of water, Mama. She slept in the mud and the rain for years. A little steam won't hurt her." Bedtime was the final surrender. For the first time in a week, Violet was back in her own room, but the doll was right there with her. It didn't go on the shelf with the teddy bears. It lay on the pillow, its hard, ceramic head resting next to Violet's soft cheek, under the bedside lamp. The doll's glass eyes seemed to catch fire, glittering with a wet, unnatural sheen. "She needs to stay close," Violet whispered, pulling the duvet up to the doll's chin. "She gets scared when there's no one to hold on to." Later, in the safety of the master bedroom, the silence between Hugh and Beatrice was suffocating. Beatrice finally broke it, her voice barely scratching the air. "That isn't her, Hugh, not really. Something inside her has shifted." Hugh wanted to argue. He wanted to offer a medical explanation, a psychological reason, anything to ground them back in reality. But the words turned to ash in his mouth. The child down the hall had Violet's face and Violet's voice, but the spirit driving the machine was different. It was watchful. It was ancient. "Where was she, Hugh?" Beatrice asked, tears finally spilling over. "Where did she go?" Hugh stared at the ceiling. "Your mother said she just materialized. One minute the garden was empty, the next she was sitting under the old oak tree, clutching that damn doll. No scratches, no dirt, no memory of the last 6 days, just back." They lay in the dark, listening to the cottage settle. But beneath the familiar groans of the timber and the wind in the eaves, Hugh heard something else. A rhythm that didn't belong in the house. A sound that made his heart hammer against his ribs. It was a sound too faint to be real, yet too distinct to ignore. A low, muffled sobbing that seemed to bleed through the walls of the hallway. It wasn't the cry of a child having a nightmare. It was the soft, rhythmic weeping of a heart breaking in slow motion. Hugh slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Beatrice, and crept into the corridor. The floorboards felt ice cold against his bare feet. Violet's door was cracked open. Through the sliver of darkness, he could see the silhouette of his daughter buried under the quilt, her chest rising and falling in the heavy, rhythmic stupor of deep sleep. Beside her lay the doll. Its pale, ceramic face was turned toward the ceiling, the glass eyes catching a stray beam of moonlight and throwing it back with a wet, unnatural glint. The weeping stopped the second he crossed the threshold. Hugh pushed the door wider. The room looked normal, the stuffed animals on the shelf, the clothes folded on the chair, but the atmosphere was wrong. The air felt thick, charged with static electricity, like the pressure drop before a thunderstorm. He moved to the bedside, intending to check Violet's temperature. That's when it happened. As he leaned over, the doll's head shifted on the pillow. It wasn't a tumble caused by the mattress moving. It was a deliberate, mechanical rotation. The porcelain neck ground against the cotton case, and those glass eyes snapped into focus, locking directly onto Hugh's face with terrifying awareness. Hugh scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He blinked, gasping for air. When he looked again, the doll was motionless. It was staring blankly at the ceiling, just an inert lump of clay and silk. He stood frozen in the doorway for 5 minutes, waiting for it to move again, waiting for a blink, a twitch, anything. But there was nothing. Eventually, he forced himself to believe it was a hallucination, a trick of shadow and exhaustion. He went back to bed, but he didn't sleep. He lay there with the hollow, sinking realization that he was sharing his home with something he didn't understand. Morning didn't break the tension, it just illuminated it. Violet didn't come running in to jump on the bed like she used to. Instead, she materialized in the doorway, silent as a specter. She stood there clutching the doll, watching her parents sleep with an unnerving, patient stillness until they opened their eyes. "Good morning, sweetie," Beatrice said, forcing a cheerfulness she didn't feel, reaching out her arms. "Did you sleep okay?" Violet didn't move toward her mother. She stayed anchored to the doorframe. "Cordelia had dreams," she stated flatly. She dreamed about her old friends, the ones who used to play in the garden with her. She misses them so much. A cold shiver raced down Hugh's spine. What happened to her friends, Violet? Violet's expression shifted into a look of profound, ancient melancholy. "They went away," she whispered. "One by one, they all disappeared." She paused, stroking the doll's glossy hair. Then she looked up, and for a second her eyes looked exactly like the glass orbs in her arms. "But Cordelia never forgets," she added softly. "She keeps them. She keeps all of them." "She keeps them right here," Violet murmured, pressing the hard ceramic body against her chest. "Inside her heart, forever." And just for a second, in the dim flicker of the hallway light, Hugh saw it. The doll's painted rosebud mouth didn't just sit there. It twitched. A subtle, impossible curl at the corner of the lips. A smirk. The following week dissolved into a gray, suffocating blur. It was as if a filter had been placed over their lives, draining the color and warmth from the cottage. Violet began to fade. She stopped touching her food, claiming she was full on air and secrets. She abandoned her coloring books and her jump rope, spending hours in the corner of the parlor, engaged in endless, whispered conferences with the porcelain figure. But the house changed too. The rooms grew unnaturally cold, a chill that the fireplace couldn't touch. Shadows seemed to detach themselves from the furniture, lingering in places where the light should have burned them away. And then there were the sounds. Footsteps packing in empty hallways, doors clicking shut on their own, and that incessant, soft weeping that drifted through the vents like a poisonous gas. Beatrice was the first to crack. The lack of sleep and the constant, crushing pressure of being watched had frayed her nerves down to the wire. She started jumping at shadows. "It's a parasite, Hugh," she hissed one evening, gripping his arm until her knuckles turned white. Violet had gone upstairs early. "That thing is evil. I can feel it tracking me through the ceiling. It's feeding on us." Hugh wanted to tell her she was being irrational, but the words died in his throat. He felt it too, a heavy, malignant intelligence that was slowly suffocating their home. "We have to get rid of it," Beatrice decided, her voice trembling with a frantic resolve. "Tonight, while she's asleep, we take it, we burn it, we bury it. She'll cry for a few days, but she'll forget. Children always forget." It was a desperate plan, born of terror. At 2:00 a.m., they crept into their daughter's room like thieves. The floorboards groaned under their weight. Hugh reached out, his hand hovering inches from the doll's silk dress. "Don't!" The voice cut through the darkness like a whip. Violet wasn't asleep. She was sitting bolt upright in bed, eyes wide open, her arms locked around the doll in a vice grip. She didn't look terrified, she looked furious. "You can't take her," she said. The tone wasn't petulant, it was authoritative. It was the voice of a jailer protecting the keys. "She chose me and I chose her. The circuit is closed now. We belong together." "Violet, please," Hugh started, his voice shaking. "We just won." "You don't understand, Papa," she interrupted, shaking her head slowly. "Cordelia has been waiting a very long time for a vessel. She needed someone who could hear the frequency. She needed someone who understands what she craves." Violet looked up. Her eyes were identical to Beatrice's in shape and color, but the thing looking out from behind them was ancient. It was a gaze that had seen centuries of darkness. "She isn't ready to go back to the dark," Violet said. "Not yet." Defeated, Hugh and Beatrice backed out of the room. It wasn't a retreat, it was a surrender. They closed the door, terrified by the cold, absolute authority radiating from their 7-year-old child. That night the house didn't just settle, it screamed. The weeping in the walls amplified, evolving from a soft whimper into a chorus of muffled, suffocated grief. Hugh lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the sound was coming from the doll itself, or if the porcelain thing acted like a beacon, waking up every restless spirit that had ever suffered on this land. The answer clawed its way out of the dirt 3 days later. Hugh was in the backyard, trying to find sanity in the simple rhythm of gardening. He was weeding the old rose bed, which had been ravaged by the weak storms. The heavy rain had scoured away the topsoil, exposing the deeper layers of the earth. He saw something white gleaming in the mud. Assuming it was a shard of broken pottery or maybe a buried stone, he knelt down and pried it loose. But as he wiped away the wet earth, his breath hitched. It wasn't stone. It was light, smooth, and terrified him instantly. It was a phalanx, a tiny, perfect human finger bone, bleached white by decades of decay. His blood turned to ice. He stared at the object, his mind frantically trying to reject what his eyes were seeing. But then he saw another white shape protruding from the soil, and another. Hugh dropped the trowel and started digging with his bare hands, tearing at the ground in a frenzy. With every handful of mud he threw aside, the nightmare grew. This wasn't a garden bed. It was a mass grave. The soil was thick with them, fragments of ribs, vertebrae, tiny teeth. He couldn't even count the bodies. There were at least a dozen, maybe more, all small, all children, all buried beneath the roses, fed upon by the roots and forgotten by the world. Forgotten by everyone, except the thing that had been waiting down there in the dark. The thing that had finally hitched a ride back to the surface in the arms of his daughter. Hugh scrambled backward, crab walking away from the charnel house, clutching that single finger bone in a trembling fist. He looked up at the cottage. There, framed in the kitchen window, stood Violet. She was holding the doll against her chest. Both of them, the child and the porcelain monster, were looking down at him. They weren't afraid. They wore identical expressions of calm, patient satisfaction. It wasn't the look of someone caught in a crime. It was the look of a director watching the audience finally understand the plot. That evening, fueled by a terrifying mixture of love and desperation, Hugh decided to fight for his daughter's soul. He found her in the drawing room. He knelt before her chair, placing himself at eye level with the thing that wore his daughter's face. "Violet," he said, his voice shaking but firm, I need you to listen to me. Tell me the truth about Cordelia, Hugh demanded, his voice trembling but firm. Where did she really come from? Who did she belong to before you? Violet didn't flinch. She stroked the doll's glossy black ringlets with the steady, mechanical rhythm of a metronome. Her eyes, vast and unblinking, bored into him. I told you, Papa, she said, her voice light and airy. She was waiting for me in grandmother's garden. But before that, Hugh pressed, leaning closer. Who made her? Who owned her? Violet's expression shifted. She looked distant, like she was reading from an invisible teleprompter. She belonged to lots of children, she recited, her voice taking on a sing-song nursery rhyme cadence. She belonged to Alice and Mary and little Christopher. They all loved her so much. They never wanted to leave. Hugh's mouth tasted like dust. What happened to them, Violet? They're still here, she whispered, hugging the porcelain figure tighter. She keeps them safe, inside her heart. They're never lonely anymore. And then Hugh heard it. It started low, but it was unmistakable. A wet, rhythmic thudding. Thump, 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 thump. It wasn't coming from his daughter. It was coming from the dog. A desperate, frantic pulse beating against the inside of that hollow ceramic chest, like a trapped bird throwing itself against a cage. Violet, Hugh gasped, the blood draining from his face. Put that thing down. Come to me, now. Violet didn't move. She just smiled, a look of serene, terrifying contentment that was far worse than any scream. She's hungry, Papa, Violet murmured. She's been starving for such a long time, but don't worry, she's about to be full again, and then we can all be together, forever. Hugh lunged. He didn't think. He just threw himself forward to save his child. But he was grabbing at smoke. Violet moved with a speed that defied physics. She slipped off the chair and flowed toward the stairs, her feet making zero sound on the floorboards. Violet, Hugh screamed, scrambling after her. He took the stairs two at a time, his breath tearing at his throat. He reached the landing in seconds, but the hallway was empty. She hadn't hidden, she had dissolved. He tore through the bedrooms, shouting her name until his voice broke, but the silence remained absolute. The house felt vacant, yet suffocatingly crowded, as if the darkness was suddenly packed with invisible spectators, watching his panic with cold amusement. When Beatrice walked through the door an hour later, she found a broken man sitting on the bottom step, staring at nothing. She's gone, Hugh whispered, the fight leaving his body. She took the doll, and she's gone. The search was a nightmare on repeat. They scoured the woods until their hands were raw and their voices were gone. The police returned, bewildered by the impossibility of a second disappearance. But there were no footprints, no broken branches, no trace. It wasn't until 3 days later that the final piece of the puzzle surfaced. Beatrice was in the nursery, mechanically packing away clothes, trying to dismantle the life of a child who had simply ceased to exist. Beatrice moved through the nursery with the robotic efficiency of a woman trying to outrun a nervous breakdown. She folded clothes and stripped sheets, her hands working frantically to keep the silence at bay. If she stopped moving, she knew she would start screaming and never stop. But as she lifted the mattress to tuck in a fresh sheet, her hand brushed against something hidden. Wrapped tightly inside one of Violet's nightgowns was a cache of secrets. Beatrice unwrapped the bundle and a cascade of photographs spilled onto the floor. They were old, ancient, really. There were cracking yellow tintypes from the mid-1800s, grainy sepia prints from the turn of the century. They showed dozens of different children, boys in velvet suits, girls in stiff, starched collars, spanning decades of history. But in every single picture, the focal point was the same. Perched on every lap, held in every small hand, was Cordelia. The doll hadn't aged a day. In every frame, she stared down the camera lens with that same smug, malevolent glint in her glass eyes, her rosebud mouth curved in a smile that knew too much. But it was the final photograph in the stack that stopped Beatrice's heart. It was a picture of Violet, but it wasn't taken in their garden. Violet was sitting in a high-backed velvet chair in an ornate candle-lit parlor that didn't exist in their world. She was wearing that strange white dress, holding the doll tight. They looked identical. They looked victorious. Beatrice flipped the photo over, her hands trembling so violently she almost dropped it. The message on the back was written in Violet's looping, childish script, but the words were a death sentence. "My new friends are waiting for you, Mama. Cordelia says there's always room for one more in her beautiful house. Come be with us. We'll be happy forever." That night the sky tore open. The rain was torrential, hammering against the roof like rocks. Hugh woke to the terrifying sensation of empty space beside him. He ran out into the storm, shouting her name, following the muddy tracks that led straight into the darkness of the backyard. He found her in the rose garden. Beatrice was on her knees in the mud, right beside the open pit where the bones had been found. She wasn't crying. She was digging. She was clawing at the wet, black earth with her bare hands, tearing at the ground as if trying to rip a hole in the world. "She's calling me," Beatrice shrieked over the roar of the wind, her nightgown soaked and clinging to her shivering frame. "Can't you hear her, Hugh? She's down there. She's calling from the dark." Hugh grabbed her shoulders, trying to haul her out of the mud, but she fought him with the hysterical strength of the possessed. She struck out, desperate to return to the dirt. "She needs me," she sobbed, her voice breaking into a raw, guttural wail. "They all need me. They're so cold, Hugh. They've been cold for so long." The storm swallowed her screams. When the sun finally broke through the gray clouds the next morning, the rain had stopped. The garden was silent. The earth was settled. And inside the cottage, Hugh stood alone. The house was empty, save for the echo of the rain and the distant, mocking toll of church bells ringing out for a congregation that would never be whole again. Sunday morning arrived with a silence that felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on the roof. Beatrice's side of the bed was cold. Her nightgown lay in a heap on the bathroom tiles. Her day clothes hung stiff and untouched in the wardrobe. Hugh found her in the garden. She was lying near the ravaged rose bed, her body curled against the wet earth as if it were a lover. Her face was turned toward the steel-gray sky, frozen in an expression that defied all logic. She was smiling. It was a look of pure, unadulterated joy. There was no mud under her fingernails, no sign of the frantic struggle from the night before. She looked like she had simply laid down to rest and let the ground swallow her whole. The police wrote it off. Heart failure, the coroner declared, citing extreme grief and exhaustion. The neighbors whispered about insanity and the fragility of the female mind. They called it a tragedy of circumstance. But Hugh knew the truth. He stayed in the cottage, a ghost haunting his own life. 3 months bled by. The garden went wild, turning into a tangle of thorns and weeds, but Hugh didn't care. He spent his nights in the drawing room, the same room where Violet had first introduced them to that hateful porcelain thing, listening to the silence. And then the silence broke. It started with that familiar, muffled weeping in the walls. But slowly, the sound shifted. The sorrow evaporated, replaced by the faint, impossible sound of children laughing. It was the sound of a playground existing on a frequency just outside of reality, a joyful, chaotic murmur drifting from the space between the floorboards and the dirt. Hugh walked to the window. The moonlight turned the overgrown yard into a sea of silver and black. But down by the rose bed, where he had unearthed the bones, something new was growing. They weren't roses. They were pale, luminescent blooms that seemed to pulsate with their own inner light. Their petals were the color of old ivory. Their centers were as black as the grave. As he watched, a shadow detached itself from the old oak tree. It was Violet. She was pristine in her white dress, the doll clutched tight against her heart. She glided across the grass, her feet hovering inches above the dew. She stopped in the center of the lawn and looked up at his window. She wasn't angry. She was waiting. And she wasn't alone. From the darkness of the woods they emerged, dozens of them. Children in velvet suits, children in rags, children from every decade of the last century. They moved with a dreamlike synchronized grace, forming a perfect circle around the glowing, bone-white flowers. They looked up at the house, their faces serene, their eyes filled with an ancient, terrifying patience. Then the circle parted. A woman in a white nightgown stepped into the center. Her hair hung loose and wild, but the lines of grief had been wiped from her face. Beatrice looked younger, lighter, radiant with a peace that the living can never truly know. She reached out a hand, not in desperation, but in welcome. Violet raised her free hand and waved, a simple, beckoning gesture. Hugh looked around the dark, cold drawing room. He looked at the empty chair where his wife used to sit. He listened to the hollow silence of a life that had ended months ago. He realized then that he wasn't afraid. The fear had burned itself out, leaving only a deep, aching loneliness. Out there in the cold and the dark was everyone he had ever loved. Hugh walked to the back door. He didn't hesitate. He slid the bolt back, click, and stepped out into the night. The cool air hit his face, smelling of damp earth and those strange, sweet flowers. As he walked toward the circle, the laughter grew louder, swelling into a symphony of welcome. When the police returned a week later to check on the grieving widower, the cottage was empty. The back door was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. The house was silent. But in the garden, beneath the shadow of the great oak tree, the wild white flowers were blooming in riotous abundance, their roots deep and tangled in the earth, feeding on the secrets that lay just beneath the surface. And on the window sill of the nursery, looking out over the empty yard, sat the doll. Her glass eyes were bright, her rosebud lips curved in a satisfied smile, waiting patiently for the next family to come home. Beatrice stood in the center of the circle, her hair cascading over her shoulders in wild, silver waves. Her arms were stretched out toward the window, reaching for him. But this wasn't the Beatrice he had known. The grief that had etched lines into her face for years was erased. She looked smooth, serene, and terrifyingly young. She possessed the same calm, radioactive happiness as the ghost children surrounding her, the look of someone who knows a secret that would shatter a living mind. She didn't speak, yet her voice resonated inside his skull, clear as a bell. "Come down, Hugh. The earth is warm, the pain stops here. We're all waiting for you." In Violet's arms, the doll snapped its head toward the second-floor window. The moonlight struck its face, igniting a cold, white fire in its glass eyes. Its porcelain lips didn't part, but Hugh felt the intrusion instantly, a psychic pressure, a silent, mocking invitation joining the chorus. "Join us." Hugh pressed his palms against the freezing glass, his breath fogging the pain. The pull was magnetic. It was almost irresistible. Every fiber of his broken heart wanted to smash the window and leap into the dark, to be folded into that impossible, deadly embrace. He wanted the loneliness to end. But deep in his reptilian brain, the survival instinct kicked in. The part of him that feared the grave slammed the brakes. With a strangled sob, he ripped the heavy curtains shut, blotting out the nightmare. He backed away into the dark house, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't sleep that night or the next. For 3 agonizing nights, the ritual repeated. The silence, the gathering in the garden, the lure of the bone-white flowers. On the 4th morning, Hugh broke. He packed a single suitcase and fled before the sun came up. He drove toward London like a man with hellhounds snapping at his tires. He convinced himself that the city, with its noise, its grime, its millions of beating hearts, would be a fortress. He told himself that ghosts couldn't follow him into the chaos of the modern world. He was wrong. 20 years have passed. Hugh lives in a cramped, peeling flat above a busy shop in Bloomsbury. He is an old man now, surrounded by millions of people, yet he has never been more alone. He hasn't escaped, not really. In the dead hours before dawn, when the traffic dies down, he still hears it, that soft, rhythmic weeping bleeding through the plaster of his walls. When he walks through the crowded underground stations, he catches glimpses of them in his peripheral vision. Small, pale figures in white dresses standing perfectly still in the rushing crowd, watching him. And on the nights when the rain falls hard and the isolation becomes a physical weight on his chest, Hugh does something he can't explain to anyone. He puts on his coat and walks the dark streets of the antique district. He tells himself he's just clearing his head. But he knows the truth. He peers into the dusty shop windows, scanning the shelves of forgotten toys. He's looking for a flash of ivory silk. He's looking for the gleam of glass eyes. He is searching for the monster that destroyed his family, not to destroy it, but because, after 20 years of silence, he is finally ready to accept the invitation. He tells himself he's just looking. He tells himself it's hate that drives him to stand outside those antique shop windows in the pouring rain, staring into the glass eyes of vintage toys. But deep down, he knows it's not hate, it's gravity. He never buys them, of course. He just stares, searching for a specific shade of ivory silk, a specific curl of black hair. He is a man circling the drain of his own trauma, drawn to the very thing that ruined him. Because he knows the truth. He knows that hundreds of miles away, in a forgotten corner of Gloucestershire, the garden hasn't died. It has thrived. Beneath the tangle of weeds and thyme, those pale, bone-white flowers are blooming in a circle of eternal silence. His family is still there. They are standing in the mist, frozen in a tableau of terrifying patience, waiting for the prodigal father to come home. And in the center of that unholy gathering, resting in the arms of the child who used to be Violet, sits the architect, the porcelain queen. She isn't sleeping. She is watching the road. She is hungry, yes, but she understands that hunger is just the prelude to a feast. She is ready to welcome the last lost sheep into the fold. But the true horror isn't in the garden. It's inside the cottage. Left behind in the rot and the dust, hidden beneath the warping floorboards where no one will ever look, is one final photograph. It's the piece of the puzzle Hugh ran away to escape. The image captures that impossible candlelit Victorian parlor. Violet is there, radiating joy. Beatrice is there, looking younger and more peaceful than she ever did in life. But they aren't alone. Standing in the corner of the frame, half obscured by shadow, is a man. He is tall, he is graying, He looks exactly like Hugh does today. In the photograph, he isn't screaming. He isn't running. He is smiling with the blank, serene surrender of the saved. The picture isn't a forgery. It's a prophecy. It's proof that his flight to London was just a temporary delay in the script. The doll doesn't need to chase him. She has already captured him. He is simply living out the final, lonely chapter before the book snaps shut. They are waiting, and sooner or later, when the silence of the empty apartment becomes too loud to bear, Hugh will realize that the fear of death is nothing compared to the pain of being the only one left alive. The collection is almost finished. It just needs one last soul to make it complete. Story 3, What the Silence Wears. The job offer didn't look right. The paper felt wet, like it had been soaking in a tidal pool, and the ink had a strange habit of shifting from black to seaweed green depending on how the light hit it. Nathaniel Wickham held it in his hands, wondering if the lighthouse board even existed anymore, or if he'd been hired by ghosts. In the village of Millhaven, the mere mention of Gull's Reach Lighthouse sucked the air out of the room. The pub went silent. Old sailors suddenly became very fascinated with their knots. The harbor master's wife actually made the sign of the cross. Only a kid named Timothy was brave, or stupid, enough to talk. Last keeper vanished after the October storms, the boy whispered, eyes wide. They found his rowboat drifting in Seal Cove. Not a scratch on it, just empty, like something called him out into the water. As the small boat chopped through the gray swells toward the island, Nathaniel started to understand the fear. The lighthouse didn't look like a beacon of safety. It looked like a skeletal finger poking out of the rock, unnaturally tall, impossibly thin, as if the physics of the place had been warped by something heavy. The boatman, Cornelius, rowed like a man escaping a fire. He dumped Nathaniel's trunks on the slick landing with rude speed. Back in 2 weeks, Cornelius shouted over the wind already pushing off. If the sea lets me. The keeper's cottage crouched at the base of the tower like a frightened animal. Inside, it was a museum of abandonment. The previous keeper's things were laid out with military strictness, boots by the door, tin cup on the table. But the logbook was the smoking gun. It lay open on the desk, the last entry dated 3 weeks ago. October 15th, 1923. Storm coming from the northeast. The fog is early tonight, and it brings something with it, but I can't write it down. Mrs. Whitmore always said prayer is the only compass that works out here, but maybe we shouldn't let it hear us praying. The last sentence wasn't written, it was carved. The pen had torn through 3 layers of paper. That first night, Nathaniel stuck to the routine. He wound the clockwork, polished the brass, and climbed the spiral stairs to light the great lens. Outside, the ocean slammed against the rocks with a violence that made the stone tower shudder. But there was a rhythm to the crashing, a beat that felt almost intentional. Then just around midnight, the foghorn blew. It started with the usual deep, mournful groan, but halfway through the blast, the sound twisted. It warped, splitting into multiple frequencies that made Nathaniel's blood turn to ice. They were voices, human voices. Eternal Father strong to save, whose arm hath bound the restless wave. The hymn poured out of the mechanical horn, transformed into a terrifying, ghostly organ powered by the lungs of the dead. Nathaniel gripped the railing, staring down at the machinery. It looked normal, but the sound was anything but. The horn blew again. The voices were sharper this time. Oh, hear us when we cry to thee, for those in peril on the sea. It was a full choir, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. singing with perfect, chilling harmony. But underneath the melody was the wet, gurgling undertone of throats filled with salt water. And then one voice cut through the noise. It hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. He knew that tenor. He knew the specific, warm timbre of that voice. It was Edmund, his brother. Edmund, who had gone down with his ship 7 years ago in the mid-Atlantic. The realization brought him to his knees. If Edmund was in that choir, then the drunken stories in the port taverns weren't just stories. The legends about sailors hearing their dead wives calling from the surf, about ships smashed on the rocks because the captain heard his mother singing. It was all real. But Edmund had died thousands of miles away. How did his voice end up here? What kind of magnet was this lighthouse? What force was powerful enough to drag souls across the ocean floor and force them to sing through a brass horn on a jagged rock in Maine? The answer didn't come from thinking. It came from watching. The next morning, Nathaniel wasn't looking for ghosts. He was looking for cracks in the masonry. He needed a structural reason for the singing, something he could fix with mortar and logic. What he found was a wound in the rock. Down near the waterline, where the tide usually concealed the island's secrets, a section of the granite face had split open. It wasn't a natural erosion. It looked like the stone had been pried apart by massive, unseen hands. The gap was barely wide enough for a human chest, but standing in front of it, Nathaniel felt a draft that made his stomach turn. It didn't smell like fresh salt air. It exhaled a stagnant, heavy stench, the smell of the crushing dark at the bottom of the ocean, mixed with something sweet and rotting. He grabbed a lantern from the supply shed and squeezed into the fissure. The tunnel didn't feel like rock. The walls were slick and smooth, covered in calcified swirls that looked less like geology and more like frozen, turbulent water. It angled sharply downward, dragging him into the gut of the promontory. Then the floor dropped away. Nathaniel stepped out onto a ledge and raised his lantern. The light barely scratched the darkness. He was standing in a cavern of impossible size, a hollow void that dwarfed the lighthouse above it. It was silent as a tomb, the air thick and still. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized the air wasn't empty. They were hanging in the void, dozens of them. Suspended in the damp atmosphere like marionettes on invisible strings, rows of bodies floated in the dark. They were sailors, drowned men. Their skin was the color of moonlight on water, pale, bloated, and preserved by the strange alchemy of the cave. Their mouths hung slack and open, as if caught in a perpetual scream, and their eyes reflected the lantern light with the flat, dead shine of a deep-sea fish. And there, in the center of the grisly display, was Edmund. Nathaniel fell to his knees, a strangled cry tearing from his throat. It was him. 7 years in the Atlantic should have reduced him to bone, but here he was bloated, blue-white, but perfectly recognizable. Edmund's face was turned toward the light. The mouth that used to sing lullabies to Nathaniel when they were children was now stretched wide in a hollow, horrific gape. But the eyes, dear God, the eyes were alive. They tracked Nathaniel. They held a spark of terrified, conscious agony. Edmund's jaw worked, the stiff muscles fighting against death, and Nathaniel saw the silent shape of the words, "Help me." In that second, the horrific mechanics of the lighthouse clicked into place. This wasn't a graveyard, it was an instrument. The cavern was a massive lung. The fissure connected the compressed air of the foghorn above to this chamber below. When the mechanism fired, it didn't just blow air through a brass horn, it forced breath through the throats of the suspended dead. The entity living in this rock, Some ancient, formless thing from the abyss, hadn't just collected these men, it had repurposed them. It was using their vocal cords like reeds in a grotesque woodwind instrument. It had learned to play them, manipulating their dead throats to mimic the hymns of the living. The lighthouse wasn't a warning system, it was a lure. It was a siren song engineered to drag ships onto the rocks. Every captain who turned his wheel toward the comforting sound of Eternal Father, strong to save, wasn't steering toward safety. He was steering toward the slaughterhouse. The foghorn was a dinner bell, ringing out across the dark water to call in the next course. It wasn't just a trap, it was an industry. Nathaniel scrambled out of the fissure, his lungs burning, and tore back into the cottage. He needed numbers. He ripped through the previous keeper's files, scattering papers across the floor. He wasn't looking for weather reports anymore. He was looking for a body count. The numbers were staggering. 43 ships. In just 10 years, 43 vessels had smashed into the reefs within a 5-mile radius of Gull's Reach. That was nearly 400 men fed to the water. The official reports were a joke: unpredictable currents, sudden fog banks, pilot error. But the keeper's private notes told a different story. A map was pinned to the back of a logbook, covered in red ink. It was a diagram of a slaughterhouse. Every wreck was plotted perfectly, creating a kill zone engineered to ensure 0 survivors. The lighthouse wasn't a beacon. It was the spider sitting in the center of the web. And the previous keeper had known. Nathaniel found a water-stained diary shoved under a loose floorboard near the stove. The handwriting was frantic, the scrawl of a man losing his mind. It knows I want to stop it. The voices, they're changing. Last night they stopped singing hymns. They sang a lullaby, the one my wife used to hum to our daughter, but my daughter died when she was 3. She never learned to sing. They have her voice now. If I stop the horn, I stop her song. If I silence the machine, I silence her soul. I can't do it. I can't let it devour her completely. Better the ships die than my little girl be lost to the dark forever. The keeper hadn't been murdered. He had been blackmailed. The entity in the cave understood human weakness perfectly. It held the souls hostage. If you cut the air supply, the voices died, and the entity consumed what was left of the spirit. It was a perfect, sadistic deadlock. Save the living ships and damn your loved ones to oblivion, or keep the machine running and feed the monster fresh meat to save a ghost. As the horror of the choice settled on Nathaniel, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the foghorn roared to life. But this time the song had changed. It wasn't Eternal Father anymore. The voices that blasted from the brass throat were warm, inviting, terrifyingly sweet. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. It was a siren song of pure comfort, promising an end to pain, an end to the cold. And woven through the melody, clear as a bell, was Edmund's voice. They sang with the terrifying sweetness of a mother calling her child in for supper. The voices pouring out of that brass throat weren't offering gold or pleasure. That's a sailor's myth. They offered something far more dangerous. They offered rest. Come to me, you who are broken, and I will give you sleep. It was weaponized peace, and cutting through the choir like a jagged knife was Edmund. His tenor was pure, identical to the voice that used to echo in the rafters of their family parish, but the invitation was warped. Come home, Nathaniel, the voice crooned, vibrating with a wet, gurgling undertone. The water is so quiet. Come take your place in the choir. We've been waiting for you. Outside, the fog didn't just roll in, it attacked. It swallowed the world in a wall of suffocating gray. But through the mist, Nathaniel saw the glow. Ship lights. He sprinted to the observation deck, jamming his eye against the telescope. It was a massive cargo steamer, the Prosperity of Boston, her decks piled high with crates bound for Europe. She was heavy, slow, and carrying at least 200 souls. Her course was dead true. She wasn't drifting. She was being piloted with confidence. The captain was steering straight for the reef, trusting the lighthouse to guide him, unaware that the beacon was actually the mouth of a monster. In 20 minutes, the Prosperity would be scrap metal. Nathaniel stood before the control panel, his hand hovering over the heavy iron breaker switch. It was the kill switch. If he threw it, the light would die. The foghorn would choke. The ship would be blind, yes, but a blind captain slows down. A blind captain hesitates. The light was giving them the confidence to commit suicide. His fingers brushed the cold metal. "Don't touch it, brother." The song stopped instantly. Edmund's voice was no longer singing. It was speaking, panicked and desperate, cutting through the static. "If you kill the light, I am gone forever." Nathaniel froze. "The thing down here, it's hungry, Nate," Edmund whispered, his voice trembling. "For 7 years it has been sipping at my soul just a little at a time. The song keeps it fed. The machine paces the meal, but if you cut the power, if you stop the music, it won't sip anymore." The horror of the equation hit Nathaniel like a hammer. "It will swallow me whole," Edmund warned. "It will finish the meal." The lighthouse wasn't just a lure. It was a preservation tank. As long as the foghorn blew, the entity was a gourmet, savoring the agony slowly, keeping the souls intact enough to suffer. But if the mechanism failed, the entity would starve, and it would binge on the only food available. The choice paralyzed him. Save the ship and erase his brother's soul, or save his brother's ghost and murder 200 strangers. Then the horn drew breath again. This time the sound didn't scrape against his nerves, it caressed them. The massive brass throat began to hum a melody that Nathaniel hadn't heard in 15 years. It was soft, lilting, and terrifyingly familiar. "Sleep, my darling, safe from harm." It was his mother's lullaby, the song she used to sing when the winter gales rattled the window panes of their childhood home. But his mother was dead. She was buried in a churchyard 3 counties away. The realization hit Nathaniel with the force of a physical blow. The entity in the cave wasn't just trapping the locals. It was a collector. It was a cosmic librarian of agony. It reached across time and space, snatching the final prayers and desperate songs of the dying, cataloging every plea for salvation ever whispered into the dark water. It didn't just play the drowned, it played the memory of love itself. This was why the previous keeper had broken. You can't fight a monster that wears the voice of the person you miss most. To stop the machine wasn't just to kill the lights. It was to silence the only record of their existence. It was to burn the library. Out in the darkness, the Prosperity was no longer a vague shape. She was a looming reality. Her searchlight sliced through the fog, locking onto the tower. Nathaniel could almost see the relief on the bridge crew's faces. They thought they had found a guardian angel. They had no idea they were steaming toward a mouth that was already opening to swallow them. Nathaniel reached for the iron switch again, his hand shaking violently. "Don't do it, Nathaniel." He froze. The voice coming from the horn wasn't Edmund's. It wasn't his mother. It was his own. It was a recording of a future that hadn't happened yet. A weary, broken version of his own voice, echoing back from the abyss. "I pulled the lever, brother. I saved the ship. And now I burn for it. I chose to save the strangers and I damned my own blood. Now I'm part of the choir. Don't make the same mistake. Don't become me. The cruelty of it was absolute. The thing in the rock didn't just feed on flesh, it gorged on guilt. It understood the architecture of human suffering perfectly. It knew that no matter which lever he pulled, Nathaniel would destroy himself. But the monster had made a miscalculation. It assumed there were only two choices, on or off, submission or sacrifice. It forgot about destruction. Nathaniel turned his back on the control panel. He sprinted out of the tower, his boots slamming against the iron stairs, and tore into the repair shed behind the cottage. He frantically kicked through piles of canvas and rusted tools until his hands closed around the cold metal tank he was looking for. The acetylene torch. If he couldn't silence the voices by cutting the power, he would silence them by melting the throat that sang them. He would cauterize the wound. He dragged the heavy tank back toward the tower, the hiss of the gas valve sounding like a promise of fire. He wasn't going to turn the lighthouse off. He was going to kill it. He climbed until his lungs burned and his legs screamed, driven by a desperation that outweighed his fear. At the summit, the great glass eye of the lighthouse rotated with indifferent, clockwork precision, casting its Judas beam across the churning water. The Prosperity was close now, close enough that Nathaniel could distinguish the silhouettes of men on the deck, men who thought they were minutes away from salvation. He sparked the acetylene torch. The blue flame hissed to life, hungry and hot. He didn't hesitate. He thrust the fire directly into the face of the optic assembly. The destruction was instant and violent. The intricate prisms, ground to focus light into a lifeline, couldn't withstand the sudden thermal shock. They cracked, popped, and finally shattered in a shower of glittering rain. The beam fractured, spraying useless, chaotic light in 1,000 directions before dying completely. Below him, the earth screamed. It wasn't a metaphor. The foghorn's mechanical drone warped, twisting into a frequency that vibrated inside Nathaniel's teeth. The choir didn't stop singing. They started shrieking. The harmony collapsed into a cacophony of pure, unadulterated agony as the connection was severed. Out in the dark, the Prosperity hesitated. Blinded, confused by the sudden death of the guide light, the captain made the only sane choice left. He aborted the approach. The ship swung hard to starboard, turning its back on the shore and retreating into the safety of the open ocean. 200 souls faded into the fog, unwittingly escaping the dinner plate. But the silence that followed was heavy with consequence. The tower shuddered. It wasn't the wind. It was a tremor rising from the bedrock. The entity, denied its meal and blinded in its own home, wasn't going back to sleep. It was waking up. The stone floor beneath Nathaniel's boots buckled. Edmund's voice clawed its way up the shaft, no longer amplified by brass, but echoing directly from the throat of the abyss. "You fool," the voice wept, thick with terror. "You haven't stopped it. You've only uncaged it. Hunger makes it bold, Nathaniel. If it can't eat here, it will hunt. It will drag itself onto the shore. It will scour the coast from here to Nova Scotia until it is full." The realization hit Nathaniel like a hammer to the chest. In saving the ship, he hadn't ended the nightmare. He had mobilized it. He had turned a trap into a predator. The entity was coming up, and once it left the rock, nothing would stop it from consuming entire villages. Unless... Nathaniel's eyes darted to the supply locker at the base of the lantern room. He remembered the crate marked with red warning text, "Dynamite," kept on hand for clearing stubborn rock falls. He looked down at the floor. The stones were pulsing now, radiating a sickening, rhythmic coldness. The creature was climbing the inside of the spire. He realized there was only one way to keep the monster in the dark. He had to bring the mountain down on top of it. It wasn't just the tower that was wrong. It was the rock it stood on. Nathaniel knelt by the base, running his hand over the foundation stones. They weren't the rough, gray granite of the coast. They were slick, oily, and black as obsidian, ancient slabs that felt like they had been dragged up from the bottom of the Marianas Trench. The lighthouse wasn't a building. It was a cork. It was a stopper in a bottle, keeping the Atlantic out and the monster in. If he cracked that seal, if he shattered the foundation, the weight of the entire ocean would rush into the void. It would crush the chamber, drowning the entity in the one thing it couldn't control: absolute crushing pressure. But there was a catch. The creature was awake. It was agitated. If he just set a timer and ran, the thing would sense the trap and flee into the open water. It needed a focal point. It needed a distraction. It needed a final meal to keep it occupied, while the walls came down. Nathaniel found the confirmation in the previous keeper's diary, scrawled on the very last page in shaky, terrified script. It won't stay for an empty plate. To kill the trap, the bait must be standing in the center of it. Nathaniel looked out at the dark horizon. He imagined the creature slithering free, drifting up the coast, turning every harbor into a graveyard. He imagined the silence of empty breakfast tables in fishing villages from Maine to Nova Scotia. He made his choice. He ran to the supply shed and dragged out the crates the previous keeper had been too cowardly to use. Dynamite. Sticks of red sweating nitroglycerin, enough to level a city block. He worked with the frantic precision of a man on a deadline, packing the explosives into the crevices of the alien black stone, wiring the structural supports to fail in a single, catastrophic instant. He was just splicing the final fuse when the air changed. The creature knew. It realized the game was up, and it played its final, most desperate card. The silence of the tower shattered. The entity didn't use the foghorn this time. It vibrated the very air in the room, projecting a cacophony of voices directly into Nathaniel's skull. It wasn't a choir anymore. It was a weaponized memory. He heard his mother, not dead in a grave, but humming the tune she used to soothe his fevers. He heard the rough baritone of his father reciting the Lord's Prayer. He heard the girl he had loved at 19, whispering the secret she had told him the night before she left. It was an assault of pure intimacy. The creature was flaying his heart open, using every person he had ever loved as a human shield. And then, cutting through the noise like a razor, came Edmund. "Don't do this to me, Nate." The voice was sobbing, broken, terrified. "I've been alone in the cold for 7 years. I waited for you. You came for me. Don't blow out the light. Don't leave me in the dark again." Nathaniel's hand hovered over the match. Tears blurred his vision, hot and stinging. The temptation to stop, to save the echo of his brother, was almost physical. It would be so easy to drop the match, so easy to just let the monster win. But he looked at the dynamite. He realized the truth. The thing below wasn't preserving his brother. It was torturing him. It was a parasite keeping its host alive just to feed on the pain. Edmund wasn't living. He was echoing. To save the dead, he had to destroy them. He had to grant them the mercy of oblivion. "I'm not leaving you, Eddie," Nathaniel whispered into the screaming air. "I'm setting you free." He struck the match. The flame flared to life, bright and unforgiving. Nathaniel didn't look back. With a steady hand, he touched the fire to the fuse. The spark caught. The fuse didn't just burn, it raced, a sizzling line of fire eager to deliver its payload. Nathaniel didn't run for the boat. He didn't look for safety. Instead, as the first muted thump of detonation shuddered through the bedrock, he turned and climbed. He scrambled back up the spiral stairs, legs burning, heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't going up there to save the light. He was going up there to watch the prison burn. The explosions triggered in a perfect lethal rhythm. Boom, boom, boom. The tower lurched violently, swaying like a drunkard. The ancient stone walls, which had stood against a century of gales, began to scream as hairline fractures shot upward, widening into jagged scars. The foundation was dissolving, pulverizing the alien rock and turning the monster's fortress into its tomb. Then Edmund's voice returned. But the fear was gone. The panic had evaporated, replaced by a sudden, crystalline clarity. The ghost understood. This wasn't an execution, it was a jailbreak. "Sing with me, Nate," the voice boomed, resonating not from the horn, but from the crumbling stones themselves. "Let's bring it down together. Let the last thing this monster hears be our defiance." And so they sang. It was a duet between the living and the dead. Nathaniel threw his head back and roared the opening lines of the Navy hymn, his voice cracking with emotion. And from the ether, Edmund joined him. They didn't sing as victims, they sang as conquerors. Eternal Father strong to save. The floor beneath Nathaniel's boots pitched forward. The glass lens shattered, raining crystal shards like diamonds. "Whose arm hath bound the restless wave?" The creature below shrieked, a sound of tectonic agony, as the dynamite shattered its resonance chamber. But the brothers sang louder, drowning out the monster's death rattle with the harmony of their childhood. "Oh, hear us when we cry to thee." The tower didn't just fall, it surrendered to gravity. With a sound that cracked the sky, the entire structure imploded, plunging straight down into the hollow throat of the cavern. The ocean, held back for centuries, rushed in with the force of a tidal wave. It slammed into the void, carrying tons of granite and steel, crushing the ancient evil under the weight of the merciless, cleansing sea. The light went black, the choir was silenced. When the Coast Guard cutter arrived 3 days later, the captain thought his charts were wrong. Gull's Reach was gone. The jagged spire was missing. The promontory had been scrubbed clean, worn smooth by the waves as if the lighthouse had never existed at all. The locals never rebuilt it. They barely even spoke of it, content to let the silence reclaim that cursed stretch of rock. But legends are harder to kill than stone. To this day, when the northeasterly gales blow hard and the fog is thick enough to chew, the old lobster fishermen say you can hear something out there in the dark. It isn't the siren song of a choir trying to drag you under. It's two voices, two brothers singing in perfect harmony, drifting over the waves. They aren't luring ships to their doom anymore. They are just singing to keep the darkness at bay, finally together, finally safe, and finally truly free.